let's bring in Mick Mulvaney. He served as acting chief of staff in the Trump White House. He's also a CBS News contributor. And Mick, I'd like to start with, why do you think that the president is pushing for, at least on social, perhaps legally, for the search warrant to be released? You knew him very close and know him closely.
Yeah, that's fairly easy. By the way, good afternoon. Thanks for having me. It's fairly easy that he's doing it because he thinks it's good for him. He senses, I think, that the political environment right now is beneficial to him, at least within the Republican Party. A lot of his potential 2024 challengers have come to his defense. Some of his critics have come to his defense, including myself. So he senses that the momentum is going his way, and that there's apparently something in the warrants and the receipt that would benefit him. It's curious that he just doesn't release it. My understanding is that he's got it. He's in possession of it and can release it. It's his receipt and so forth. I am curious. Catherine Herridge made an excellent comment about the affidavit. That's really where the good material is. Yeah. The DOJ has not mentioned that, and for some reason, Trump has not mentioned that yet either. So Trump is doing what he's doing because he thinks to his benefit. I'm not sure why he's not calling for more and for the DOJ to release the affidavit.
I mean, it sounds like he didn't have an option. If a judge rules on releasing it, you should absolutely support the release.
At this point, it would look very odd for him to say, well, I don't want it released after sort of calling for it to be released, right? All right, so Mick, we have seen reports, as everyone has, that an informant potentially tipped off the FBI, and you've said that that person would have to be someone close to the former president. Do you still think that, and can you tell us why?
I do, and here's why. And again, I could be wrong. It's always hard when you're trying to sort of predict Donald Trump. I think I've proven that famously a couple of times. But anyway, it's a small group of people in Mar-a-Lago. His staff in Mar-a-Lago is not nearly what the staff of a West Wing would be. It's going to be a small group to begin with. Secondly, the president he's a fairly private person in some ways. I was only ever allowed into the anteroom outside of his private residence at Mar-a-Lago one time, and that was on the release of the Mueller report. So he doesn't let staff sort of come and go in the private areas of Mar-a-Lago. Mar-a-Lago is a hotel, a restaurant, a club, and also his private residence is off to the side. So there'd be it's not like he brings guests to dinner into his private part of his residence, which is where I assume the safe would be. And that raises another point, which is that I was his chief of staff for 15 months. I've been to Mar-a-Lago a dozen times. I had no idea there was a safe on the residence. That it could be an ordinary hotel safe, but that's not what I think we're talking about here. This was his private safe, and I didn't know that exists. You put all that together, and my guess is it's a very small universe of people who knew the facts that they could give to the FBI to support an affidavit for a search warrant.
Well, the internet has been speculating nonstop about how close this mole could be. Yeah. Now, one of the most concerning, beyond, of course, what the DOJ is looking into, aspects of this story is the reaction to it. When it comes to the uptick in violent threats against lawmakers and against FBI officials and FBI agents who are doing their job, do you think that the president has a responsibility to try to tamp down the temperature? And of course, that seems like an obvious question, but do you think he will take that responsibility and try to appease people as he, may have tried towards the end of the day in January 6th?
Look, I think everybody has a responsibility to try and tamp down violence. No one should be out there encouraging violence on the left or the right. What I think a lot of folks on the left side of the aisle are missing here is that the right thinks that they're the only ones who are being called on to downplay violence. Last month, left-wing extremists in Portland lobbed 2 mortars into a federal building, but the federal government didn't seem to say anything about it. There's attempts at violent protests outside of Supreme Court justices' homes, and it doesn't seem to get the same attention. So there's a perception, whether or not it's real or not, it's hard to say. There's a perception that equation only works one way, that whenever there's violence, it's the Republicans' fault, and it's incumbent upon them to sort of downplay it. I don't think anybody should be encouraging violence. I respected what Attorney General Merrick Garland said yesterday. He's right to defend his people. But I think folks have to understand more broadly that there is a sense in some parts of our population that is not balanced at this point.
Well, you're saying that's whataboutism, but do you see the president trying to tamp it down or continue?
The former president.
The former president, former president trying to tamp it down or trying to say, look, it's gone too far. I mean, we were continuously reporting on this incident in Cincinnati yesterday, but it sure is concerning that there, may have been, because of this situation, an attempt against an FBI office.
All of it is disconcerting. There's no question. And I am encouraging people not to be violent. I know that you are doing the same. I think that most responsible people are doing so. But to dismiss it as whataboutism, and that's an interesting term, is really saying, look, we know there's a double standard, but we're going to ignore it. What about what happened in Portland? What about is happening to Supreme Court justice? That's a fair discussion to have more broadly. Look,
yeah, those are big stories.
No, those are big stories, and you make a very, very good point. But you could also argue that these calls for violence on the left, as you put it, aren't coming from the highest corridors of political power on the left, right?
That's fair. I think Donald Trump is. Listen, January. Like we can talk about January 6th all day if you want to. I don't think he's encouraging violence here. But you're right. He's not come out and encouraged people to calm down. And I think everybody would benefit from that. There's nothing good going to come from going after the judge who signed the search warrant, going after the agents who executed the warrant. They're doing their job. I think come back to how you solve the situation. I think transparency is the key. And it's why, again, I come back to that affidavit. Keep in mind, it was the affidavit that was false that the DOJ and the FBI presented to the FISA courts back in 2016 as part of the investigation of the Trump campaign. So Republicans are familiar with what the affidavits are. That affidavit was false. If you come out with the affidavit today and say, look, here's the information that we showed to the judge in South Florida to get the search warrant, it might calm people down because they have a chance to read it. Right now, there's the fog of war. There's a bunch of half information, half stories. There's a Washington Post story that uses the word nuclear. The New York Times won't use that word. There's a bunch of half pieces of information. I think we all benefit by getting good information out there so we can make solid decisions and not resort to emotion, which is what leads to violence.
And we're trying to get that information out there. That's what we're trying to do.
Fill in those blanks, you're right, and all for transparency. Mick Mulvaney, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sean.